Bro, the wildest part is he treats creativity like oxygen. Not talent, not luck, just something you either breathe or choke on. And his mom was basically running a boot camp in that kitchen. That is the part people miss when they talk about success. Everybody wants the Super Bowls. Nobody wants the thrift store engineering. The detail about turning old clothes into new ones is insane. That is where taste gets built, not in some luxury studio. Bro had remix culture before people had Wi-Fi. And the food stamp coin hack is straight-up survival genius. But also, that teaches resourcefulness like nothing else can. Do you think that kind of upbringing makes ambition calmer? Or does it make you permanently allergic to ease? I think it can do both, honestly. He sounded like somebody who never confused poverty with stupidity. That Japan example was actually very clean. Like, can you read a room? Can you survive? Can you build? His mom was refusing the stigma before he even knew the word stigma. And the suits to school were such a power move. Imagine being the poor kid dressed sharper than everybody else. The kids are confused. The system is confused. Everybody loses. That is identity as armor. And then he finds out he is poor because of a school food drive. That is such a brutal little childhood plot twist. Like, imagine discovering your class status in real time. That can either break a kid or make them weirdly fearless. He clearly became the second one. Because by 14, he is already handing out demos like a tiny executive. Bro was basically running a label from a bedroom. And the Teddy Ruxpin hack is where it gets ridiculous. That is not just creativity, that is robbery-level curiosity. He looked at a toy and saw a production pipeline. That is what people mean when they say some kids are just built to make. But I love that his mom celebrated the making instead of the polish. That matters. Because early encouragement changes the whole nervous system. It creates a person who is not scared to be seen trying. Most people are not scared of failure. They are scared of witnesses. That line hit hard when he said creativity and anxiety are linked. Because if you are always performing for approval, you are not creating. You are just doing cosplay with better lighting. Yes, exactly, you are wearing the costume of a creative. His sponge metaphor was actually nasty in a good way. Absorb, rinse, repeat, then contribute. People want the output, but they do not respect the inner mess. And he is saying the mess is the point, not a bug. Do you buy that creativity has to be selfish first? Because part of me wants to say art should help people immediately. But his argument is that it has to save you before it saves anybody else. And honestly, that sounds more honest. Because otherwise you are just marketing your emotions too early. He also had that interesting point about hard work being relative. Like your pinky thinks your lungs are working hard? Bro, that was such a strange but perfect image. The bigger point is some people call necessity discipline. If you are raised in scarcity, effort does not feel heroic. It just feels like Tuesday. That is why his definition of humility is different too. He is not talking about smallness. He is talking about receptivity. Like stay open or you stop getting information. Which is brutal because ego literally blocks input. And in creative work, input is the whole game. The predator line was wild, though. Humble, curious, and a predator all at once is a crazy combo. Basically be a monk with teeth. That is actually a great way to put it. Because he is saying you need hunger without arrogance. And you need discipline without becoming dead inside. That is the real tension in all ambitious people. The fear part was probably the most relatable thing he said. Because fear is usually just social pressure wearing a fake mustache. That is exactly it, bro. If you are worried about what people think, the work changes shape. You start editing your instincts before they even exist. Then you are not making art. You are making a defense mechanism. And that kills the whole thing. His vomit metaphor was outrageous but accurate. He really said sometimes you just have to let it out. Which is kind of beautiful if you strip the shock out of it. Because creation is often just internal pressure finding a shape. But he also warned that once you are only doing it for approval, you are cooked. That part is important for every creator listening. Success can actually make you less creative if you start performing the brand. Now the algorithm is your boss and your therapist. Which is a horrible arrangement, by the way. I also thought his relationship stuff was stronger than people may expect. Like, he is not anti-relationship, he is anti-distraction from purpose. He basically wants someone who can ship life with him. That is such an engineer way to describe love. Ship a piece of you to the future is kind of a bar, though. But then he pivots to this idea of volume, not an off switch. That is a useful distinction for people like him. You do not kill the motion, you lower the intensity. Because fully switching it off would probably make him miserable. And maybe the real skill is learning to be present without getting trapped. That is harder than people think. His electron and proton thing was weirdly brilliant, too. I cannot believe we are doing particle physics in a relationship conversation. Apparently, love is STEM now. But his point is that stillness is relative to your nature. If your nature is motion, then motion is your stillness. Which is poetic but also dangerous if you use it as an excuse. Because you still have to learn empathy in someone else's rhythm. And that is where the compromise lives. Not in pretending you are a different person. The marriage and kids part was the most revealing shift, though. He used to think family would slow the climb. Then he realized it might actually organize the climb. That is such a mature realization. Because ambition alone can make life feel abstract. But family forces the future to become concrete. Suddenly the work is not just about you being brilliant. It is about diapers, calendars, and actual accountability. And he sounded genuinely happy about that change. Not scared, not defensive, just ready. That is rare in people who built themselves from nothing. Because they often stay married to the struggle. He seems like he is trying to graduate from survival mode. And maybe that is the real theme of the whole conversation. Like, yes, be creative, but do not let creativity eat your life. Because eventually even geniuses need a nap. Finally, a universal law. All right, we should leave it there before we turn into particle physicists. Episode 1 came with a lot more depth than I expected. Next one gets even more interesting because the control issue gets even deeper. And the real question becomes whether success ever quiets the mind. Yeah, because success does not automatically switch the noise off. It just gives the noise a nicer room to echo in. That is such a brutal way to say it, but it is true. And what hit me was how early the creativity was treated like survival. Not hobby, not talent, like actual currency. Bro was basically negotiating with the world using tape decks. And winning, which is the wild part. That mother-son dynamic was not soft encouragement, it was training. She was building confidence and discipline at the same time. A lot of modern parents are just building anxiety with better branding. That is unfairly accurate. But think about it. She made him feel valuable before money did. That changes the whole operating system. And the suit thing is such a tiny detail that says everything. Like, you are poor, but you are not dressed like you are waiting to be rescued. That is dignity with the collar on it. Yes, exactly, a very serious collar. I also liked how he framed poverty as something he discovered, not something he internalized forever. That is a huge difference psychologically. Because if you know too early, you can start performing scarcity. And he was saying the opposite, that the household taught resourcefulness. Turning thrift store scraps into identity is actually insane. And kind of cooler than half the luxury stuff people flex now. Definitely more original than a logo on a hoodie. The bigger point for me is he did not talk about creativity like inspiration. He talked about it like a muscle with rules. Humility, competition, curiosity, predator energy, all of it. Bro said, be humble but also be a predator, which is such a sentence. That is the most industry answer ever. But I get what he means, because if you are too soft, you do not study. And if you are too arrogant, nobody feeds you information. That part was sharp, like ego closes the sponge. He really did make everything into a kitchen or body metaphor. And somehow it still worked. The failure part was the most useful because he did not romanticize fear. He basically said fear is often social, not artistic. You are not scared of making bad work, you are scared of being judged. Which is why half the internet has never made anything. That line should be in a museum. And his sponge and vomiting analogy was aggressive but clean. The idea is you have to empty yourself to absorb more. That is actually a great way to think about making art. Because then the output is not about impressing people. It is about clearing space for the next thing. And only after that does it become useful to other people. I liked that order because it is not fake altruism. First, it has to help you understand the world. Otherwise, you are just performing usefulness. Which is basically linked in a sentence. The relationship section got weird in a good way, though. because he was not saying connection is impossible, just that it has to match your motion. And if you are always scanning, that can feel like love to you but like surveillance to somebody else. That is the uncomfortable truth right there. Imagine dating somebody who treats the sunset like a research assignment. Romantic in a very laboratory way. But his point about the electron still moving was interesting because he is basically saying presence can look different. That is a generous interpretation of partnership. Like you do not have to become the other person to care about them. You just have to genuinely understand what they need from your motion. That is actually a mature way to think about love, which is annoying because it means you cannot just blame the concept of marriage. You have to blame your own inability to sit still. And then he got into kids, and that was the emotional turn. He is not anti-family, he is just anti-rushing the timing. But now he sounds like somebody who sees kids as legacy, not interruption. That is the key shift right there. When you are younger, you think responsibility blocks the mission. Later you realize it sharpens the mission, sometimes more than your own ambition ever did. And the part about his family history was heavy without being dramatic. Like the resilience was inherited, not invented. That is why success did not make him feel finished. It made him feel accountable. To his mom, to his community, to the people behind him, and to whatever cosmic spreadsheet decided he had more work to do. I think that is the episode's real spine. Not talent, not fame, but the burden of carrying what built you, and figuring out whether you can still be creative without being consumed by the machine, which is a much harder sentence than it sounds. All right, let us park it there before we turn this into a philosophy seminar, because we were dangerously close to becoming very self-serious. Next episode, we go deeper into control, fear, and what success really costs, because he was basically building a studio out of whatever was lying around. And that part is so wild because creativity started as survival, not branding. Like his mom was not teaching aesthetics, she was teaching resourcefulness. Turning thrift store chaos into a whole identity is kind of gangster. And the big thing is, she did not let poverty become shame. That changes a kid's whole nervous system, honestly. Because if you grow up feeling poor, you can shrink fast. But if you grow up feeling useful, you move differently. Bro was making Teddy Ruxpin rap before most people knew what sampling was. That is not just talent, that is unhinged curiosity. And I love that nobody clapped for the idea first. He made the thing because he wanted to hear it exist, which is actually the cleanest definition of creativity I have heard. Also, schools definitely were not ready for a kid like that. And then the suit thing is so telling. His mother was literally dressing him like school was a mission. Not to blend in, to stand up straight. Imagine the poor kid walking around looking like he owns 3 companies. That is how you confuse the class system before lunch. But that is also the first lesson in identity being a tool. Like your clothes are not decoration, they are a message. And then he flips it into this whole argument about humility and hunger, which I think is where a lot of people get it wrong. People think creativity is just vibes, but he is saying it is discipline plus appetite. And competition matters too, which people hate hearing, because nobody wants to admit they are secretly ranking themselves every day. Exactly, everybody is pretending they are above the race. But he is saying you need a target or you just drift. Though I do think he pushes it into predator language pretty hard. Yeah, that is the part I wrestle with a little. Because if you are always hunting, you can lose your softness. But maybe he would say softness without edge is just decoration. That man would absolutely say that with a straight face too. The hard truth is he connects creativity to output, not to self-expression alone. Like, it has to move you, then it has to move others. And that is where the sponge metaphor gets interesting. Absorb, rinse, repeat, then contribute. He really turned emotional overflow into a manufacturing process, which sounds clinical until you realize it is basically how artists live. The fear part is where it gets uncomfortable. Because he is saying fear is often just other people living in your head. And that is brutal, because it is true way too often. Once you care too much about approval, the work gets contaminated. Suddenly you are not making art, you are making a group project. Yes, and group projects are where creativity goes to die. But then he goes one level deeper and says the point is therapeutic first. That part I actually think is underrated. You make sense of yourself before you try to impress the world. That is such a healthier order than the one most people live by. And then he ties that to optimism and purpose, which is not fluffy at all. It is actually a defense mechanism against chaos. Because if the world keeps hitting you with things you did not choose, you need something inside. Otherwise, anxiety runs the whole company. Anxiety as CEO is a terrible outcome. The relationship stuff is where he surprises me most, though. Because he is not saying love is a distraction, he is saying it needs translation. Like, can someone relate to your movement without trying to freeze it? That electron and proton thing is bizarre, but I get the point. It is bizarre in the exact way a brilliant person explains a feeling. He is basically saying stillness is relative if your nature is motion. And that is a pretty honest way to talk about partnership. Like, do not ask the tornado to become a lake. Although some people definitely try that in relationships, and then act shocked when it gets weird. What I respect is he seems to understand the cost now. The constant movement, the scanning, the over-analysis, all of it has a price. And he is finally admitting he cannot build a family the same way he built a career. That is a big shift for somebody who had to do everything himself. Because when nobody believes in you, control becomes a survival skill. And then success makes that same control start feeling like a cage. The irony is ruthless. He wanted to be the engine, the manager, the designer, the financier, everything. And now he is like, wait, maybe I can let people help me. That is growth, honestly. Not glamorous growth, but real growth. And the kid point is huge because it is not about timing anymore, it is about structure. He is saying a child could have made him more organized, not less free. Which is the opposite of how a lot of ambitious people think. The mountain metaphor is really what stays with me. He thought the climb was solo, then realized the climb was always for other people. That is a massive reframe. Also, the way he says he was wrong but still right is very human. That is basically every successful person trying to explain their own biography. I think the episode lands because it never treats creativity like a luxury. It treats it like a way of staying alive, then a way of serving. And that is why the whole thing feels bigger than music. It is about what kind of person gets forged when pressure never really lets up, and whether that person can ever sit down for 5 minutes without solving the universe, which, respectfully, does not seem likely here. But that is what makes him interesting, not just successful. All right, let us leave it there before we start diagnosing our own childhoods on mic. Because we are already one tangent away from confessing too much. Next episode, we get into control, fear, and the emotional price of always being on. The wild part is he does not treat creativity like magic. He treats it like training. Like you can actually build it if you have the right pressure and the right habits. Which is a very inconvenient answer for people who want talent to feel mysterious. Because then it is not destiny. It is discipline plus imagination. And that mother piece is not just sentimental, it is structural. She was literally turning thrift store scraps into identity. That is such a gangster creative origin story, by the way. The thing I kept hearing was, she did not just support him, she coached his reality. Like, stop saying nothing, stop acting invisible, say what you are doing. Imagine your mom being like, no, you are not doing nothing in this house. Even your silence had to be productive. And that builds a kid who thinks agency is normal. Not a kid who waits to be rescued. A kid who fixes the radio. Bro, the Teddy Ruxpin tape hack is insane. That is not child behavior. That is startup founder behavior with worse tools. Headphone into the microphone jack is pure trial and error genius. And what I love is he did not call it cleverness, he called it currency. That is a huge mindset shift, because he was not waiting for validation from institutions. He was getting paid in the feeling of making something work. And then school basically confirmed it by turning him into the poor kid story. That part is brutal, because he did not even know the label until they handed it to him. And then the suit thing is genius, honestly. If you are poor but dressed like a tiny congressman, the math gets confusing. The neighborhood cannot even place you neatly anymore. But that is also a defense mechanism, right? He is separating himself from the script people wanted to put him in. I think that is where the confidence starts, not from money, from being harder to categorize. And then he hits the creativity question like a man who has argued with this for decades. His answer is basically, become more curious, more humble, and more competitive. And also a predator. which is such a dramatic word to use in a creativity conversation. But he means it in the most flattering way possible. He is saying you have to hunt for ideas, not wait for them to tap you on the shoulder. That is why the Prince and Stevie Wonder references matter so much. He is describing creativity as a chain of obsession and imitation and then transcendence, which is way less romantic than people like to pretend. And he is weirdly anti-arrogance about it too. Because once you get too full of yourself, people stop feeding you information. That line is so true it almost hurts. Like arrogance is not confidence, it is informational starvation. The room goes quiet and suddenly your genius is just lonely. Then the hard work thing gets really interesting because he refuses to worship effort for its own sake. He is basically saying hard work is relative to the system you are operating in. And he uses the body as proof, which is such a strange but effective move. Your pinky and your lungs are both working, but in completely different leagues. He really said, do not give your lungs a fake motivational poster. But it works because he is trying to say the universe is already full of involuntary labor. So the creative life is not just grind, it is choosing where to place your effort. And that leads to the fear question, which I thought he handled brutally. If you are afraid of judgment, maybe you are not really creating, you are performing creativity. That is a painful distinction for a lot of people. Because once he compares creativity to vomiting, the point lands immediately. Not elegant, not polished, just get it out before you overthink yourself into a coma. And then he somehow makes manure sound spiritually necessary. Which is rude to say and also correct. The whole idea is that output becomes useful only after it is honest. First, it helps you make sense of yourself. Then it can help other people. He is not chasing impact first, he is chasing truth first. And then the relationship section gets even better because he applies the same logic there. He is basically saying love is also about relating around motion, not freezing someone in place. He and the host doing electron versus proton like they are solving chemistry at a dinner table. And somehow that analogy is not even the weirdest one he made. But I get what he is reaching for, which is that stillness is relative. To one person you are calm, to another person you are still moving at full speed. So the real work in relationships is empathy, not self-erasure. If you cannot explain your movement, people will just experience it as noise. And that is where a lot of high-functioning people blow up their own relationships. Because they think being understandable is the same as being diminished. Then the kid question turns into the big life question, and I thought that was the emotional center. He does want kids, but only after he feels he can actually provide without panic. Not just money, but structure, safety, and presence. And he is admitting that earlier he thought speed was the only route. That is such a common success trap, though. You think the mountain must be climbed the same way forever, even after you have changed. Meanwhile, the mountain is not that loyal to your old strategy. It does not care how hard you were grinding in 2002. What struck me most is he finally sounds ready to trade chaos for architecture. Not less ambition, just less self-inflicted frenzy. And that is where the whole conversation gets bigger than music. It becomes about whether relentless people can ever learn how to receive. Because building things is one skill, resting inside them is another. And that is the tension I want to keep following next episode. Because once control enters the room, everything gets messier. And honestly, that is where the really revealing stuff starts. All right, let us leave it there before we start speed-running our own therapy. Episode 2 gets into control, fear, and what it costs to stay on all the time.